Okay.
Welcome to Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bronwyn Williams, a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And in conversation with me today is Chris Huet. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for having me on.
It's really good to have your input today. Now, Chris, can you tell us a little about yourself and what you do in the real world and the virtual world?
I am a communications coach. I help people be better communicators and better public speakers. I like to say that I help people speak with the precision of a fighter pilot and the passion of a poet, because they're two parts of my background that kind of distinguish me. I spent 20 years in the Air Force as a pilot and an instructor. And then I worked in consulting and also in business development in industry. At the same time, I write and perform poetry on stage, and I've been doing that for a bit over 10 years. And a few years ago, I realized that the part of my work that I love is communicating, whether that was helping someone learn a new skill, or it was listening to a customer, or pitching an idea, as well as creatively communicating in through poetry and other forms of art. And I wanted to bring all of those parts of communication together and help people harness all of the beautiful ways that language can be used to be more effective and more influential in their work and their personal lives.
Wow, that's so interesting. I am super jealous. I too write poetry, but I just have never been able to step into that performance poetry space. And I have seen many people do it and do it extraordinarily well. So yes, highly jealous of you being able to do that.
It's just something that I happen to really enjoy and have been relatively successful at doing. So I'm just lucky to have those things and the ability to do it.
Look, that's wonderful, Chris. Now, as you know, these conversations are around bias, and I've called this series Bringing Bias in from the Cold because I believe we're all biased. Doesn't matter what age you are, nationality, economic demographic, we're all biased, but we resist talking about it because there's a certain level of shame and perhaps guilt around it.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to normalize it. I want to normalize the conversation and say, let's talk about it. Let's bring it in from the cold, because when we talk about it, then we can actually address it and do something with it. So how would you define bias, Chris?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I don't think anybody's actually asked me to do this. So I'm making it up on the fly a little bit, but
That's good.
It is something that I see a lot in communication, because we tend to filter everything that we hear and see through certain filters. So I would say bias is the tendencies that we have to ascribe certain meanings to different things, experiences that we have, based on nature and nurture. So biologically and also our own experience, our culture, our socialization, things that have happened to us. So it's all about our tendency to ascribe certain meanings or tend toward one direction rather than another in response to something that we've seen or heard.
That's excellent. And sorry, I was just jotting down because I wanted to make sure I remembered. I loved the fact that you've said that bias is all about meaning. And that is just, for me, that's so true from my perspective as well, because we are meaning-making machines. We attach meaning to everything. And it's those meanings that we attach perhaps as another person I was in conversation with, which I'm sure you know, Maz Farrelly.
I know the name, but not personally.
Well, Maz talked about biases being around our experiences, and I thought, well, that's true too. And if we put those two together, it's about what we experience and the meaning we attach to it. And then I think probably I add a third thing to make a triangle. So it's our experiences plus the meaning, and then the decisions we make. around that. What do
Yes.
we do that with that meaning out of those experiences?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And in communication, we, an important concept of communication is the meaning of your communication is the way it's actually received from a transmitting perspective. So if you want to influence somebody else, if you want to teach someone something, or if you just want to get a message across, you need to think about how that person's going to receive it. So often in my work, I talk a lot about how you need to prepare for how other people might be biased and the ways and preferences they have in receiving information. So that is effective from a transmission perspective. But then we also need to turn that inwards on ourselves and think about how we do the same thing. So we need to be conscious that when we're receiving information, when people are transmitting to us, we need to try and remove as much of that bias as we can to get what their original meaning was, because we'll ascribe the meaning that we have to it because of the way that we are programmed and the biases that we do have in it.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's one of the reasons why I love these conversations, is because they bring up ideas and different ways of thinking about that. And I loved what you talked about transmission, because it's not just the words, that we come back to that idea of meaning. It's the meaning that the speaker gives to the words, but also the meaning then that the receiver ascribes to those words. And I had just that experience yesterday. I was in conversation with a young woman from Ghana. She's part of my series. And as I talked with her and asked her about her experience of bias, she was describing a situation which would have been common in Australia 50 years ago, about very designated roles and about how men had to do certain things and women had to do other things. And part of me inside was doing the whole, oh, poo, poo, poo. We've moved on from that in Australia. And I did actually mention to her in the conversation that we are probably in different places as to different countries and traditions. But as I listened, I had to be aware of my own biases around a developed nation as opposed to a developing nation, and actually listen to what she had to say, because this is her reality. It's not mine. We struggle with other things around gender roles in Australia. Theirs are much more defined, just as ours were 50 or 60 years ago. But I had to choose to be aware of what my biases were also automatically making me do, and go, no, Bronwyn, just listen and hear what she has to say out of her experience.
Yeah, and that's to be an effective listener, you need to put aside judgment. You need to let go of your thoughts and just focus on what the other person's saying. And it's so difficult to do, because we leap to that meaning. We ascribe meaning to what they're saying straight away, and you've got to try and ignore that voice and don't judge what they've said. Just seek to learn more about it. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
It is. And I think the more that we talk about this, I'm all about awareness and raising awareness. I often say that awareness is more than 50% of the game, because you can't actually address something you're not aware of. Yeah. So have you got an experience that you'd be happy sharing around bias? Maybe something where you've become aware of your own biases, or you've been on the receiving end of someone else's bias, and how you handled that situation?
Well, I think I come from a privileged position, and I think in the business world that I've most recently been working in, I am often on the beneficiary of bias, I think, because I'm, the white middle-aged man, straight, able-bodied, neurotypical, have English as a first language. So immediately people assume that I'm more competent than I am in general. So I think that's a
I suppose that's a nice bias to be on the receiving end of.
It is, yeah. but I did spend 20 years in the Air Force, and great experience. I worked with some of the most competent, dedicated, disciplined people that I've ever met, but also a very homogenous group of people. And because you're training to work in a high stress environment, you develop a certain way of communicating, which is necessary and also a product of that everybody's essentially the same.
Yes.
So coming out of that world and working in a much broader, more diverse environment, both through my poetry in the arts sort of scene, and then in the work that I do now, which was with a much broader range of people who are seeking to be better communicators, I have had to change the way that I communicate. And I noticed that I had certain assumptions about how I was communicating effectively that turned out to not be effective at all. So when I'm transmitting, sometimes being less direct, asking more questions before getting to the conclusion. And when I'm listening, to be more animated when I listen. I have learned a lot from my partner. She has a much more diverse lived experience than me, and she works in diversity and inclusion. And when we were first together, I often would look sort of blank-faced at her when she was talking to me. And she assumed that meant I wasn't engaged at all. I wasn't listening to her. And no, that I was paying like a lot of attention. It's just that from my military background, and probably more also from growing up that way, it was, you were never very animated, but you were always listening and paying attention. And I would call this my listening for orders face. It was sort of just a blank stare. So I've learned to become more animated, to show more emotion, to be more energetic.
Yes.
It's not something that you would normally do in a controlled, disciplined military environment, but it's necessary to communicate more effectively with a wider range of people.
That is so interesting, isn't it? Because whenever I talk about bias, I say that, it forms often in our formative years from the culture, whatever that culture is. And for you, I would imagine as a young man that you've gone into this culture, which you want to be a pilot, my goodness, living so many boys' dreams to be a pilot, but it comes with a particular culture that then influences the way that you communicate. That it makes a lot of sense, but it's fascinating that then, because you learnt that communication meant this sort of response, like just listen, pay attention, but don't show any response, because I could imagine if you were given a command and you didn't like it and you showed it in the military, that would not be a very helpful thing to do.
No, true, yeah.
Oh, look, that's excellent, Chris. So from your own experience, as you become aware of biases, what's been your experience? Do you find it very easy to deal with them? Is it a backwards and forwards thing? You make, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Do you find that you fall back into like a default position? How have you learnt to handle your own biases and the changes that you've needed to make?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's really hard. It requires continuous work to overcome, to be aware of all of your biases and then to overcome them. And it is definitely a sort of step thing. So you'll get to 1 step and then you try and crawl up to the next step, and you every now and then bounce back to where you are now. And then finally you'll make a progression. If you don't work on it, and I have done this as well, and have to slap myself around the face when I realize I've done it. You just slipped back to the old way. And biases are natural. I think stereotyping and ascribing meaning very quickly, we do from an evolutionary biology perspective. I think our brains are naturally lazy. So if we can skip straight ahead to a conclusion and get on to the next point, our brains want to do that. So we have to fight that continuously. I have found that surrounding myself with people with different perspectives trying to remind myself to ask questions and listen first, not to do that leap to the,
Yep.
oh, so that's the order, I'll go and do that now, or here's the conclusion, here's the solution. To do those sorts of things and learn as much as possible. That's what I've been trying to do. And from a lot of really fantastic people that I've had the privilege of meeting, I have learnt a lot and expanded my experience. So trying to get outside that cloistered, the view that you get from all of the people who are like you. But it's a continuous struggle. I can't say that I will ever be, at the end. And I still get disappoint myself occasionally when I fall back into making an assumption and I realize, oh no, that's just based on some bias or stereotype that you'd formed in your mind and you weren't really listening.
Yep. Yeah, look, I totally agree. I feel that almost biases are part of our DNA, often because they form very early in life and they are very much an unconscious part of how we respond. And I loved also what you said about our brains being lazy. And I'm reading a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And you probably read that. And and he talks about, system 1, which is the automatic, the quick, and system 2, which is that really slower thinking. And I'm really glad that you said that, because that's helping me, in a sense, make sense of this quite academic book, which does not sit in, like I've done academic work, but not in this area. So it's causing me to take it slowly, but to connect the dots now for myself and see that our biases fall into that quick thinking, that system 1, but also that we make the decisions around what we do with our biases with that slow thinking, that system 2. And because our quick thinking is our automatic thing, we do slip back very, very quickly. And as you say, our brains are lazy. We would much prefer to take the easy route than the harder thinking route when it comes to making any sort of change.
Yeah. And that's a fantastic book. I love the fact that he gives so many case studies and practical examples of all of the different ways our brain thinks. And yeah, I'd recommend that book to anybody, but it's not a very short or an easy read. It's easy read, but it is very methodical.
It is very methodical. And because I'm not it talks a lot about probability and things, and that just was not my area of expertise in math.
Oh, yes.
But I think from having done academic work in the past, I know that I don't actually have to take in every detail. It's about understanding the ideas behind what's being written.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Chris. So just before we bring our conversation to a close, is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation today?
Oh, I think we've covered most of what I've seen from bias, I think, and also how it's something that's very evident in the work that I do. So most of the time I focus on helping people be better public speakers or communicators, so they're aware of the filters, those biases they might need to get past, and talk about first impressions, how we can't avoid making them. So people making an impression of whether they should trust you or how competent you are immediately you stand on a stage or in front of them. But it's also, this sort of discussion has also reminded me that we need to think the other way as well, so that when we are listening to other people or we are interacting with other people, we're putting those filters up as well.
Yes.
And we're not going to get the most out of other people and listen as well if we're not aware that we have these filters and we've immediately made judgments about another person, possibly because they don't hold eye contact, which could be for a whole range of reasons. It could be cultural or the way their brain is made up or a past experience. So we need to be aware of those things when we're listening to other people and try and put those judgments to one side. So it works both ways, the way that these filters come up through our biases in communicating. And that's something that I've been very conscious of recently.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's been fantastic to have your input into this conversation around bias. And so this is Bronwyn Williams signing off from Bringing Bias into the Cold, in from the Cold.